Always one. Sorry, butters. Yeah. Welcome, everybody. Welcome. Lovely to see such a nice crowd, and hello to our folks on Zoom. My name is Connie Brooks, and I'm with Batten Hill Books. We are doing a hybrid event tonight, so we are both in person as well as on Zoom. And just so everyone knows, we are making a recording of the event, which I like to mention. So fantastic to see so many people. I think we have maybe one extra chair, so we filled the house. So it's pretty good. Yeah, fantastic. I want to introduce Amy Godine from Saratoga Springs. Independent scholar Amy Godine writes and speaks frequently on many aspects of Adirondack ethnic and social history and racial justice topics. She has a BA in American Studies from Hampshire College and an MFA in fiction writing from the Iowa Writers Workshop. She writes regularly for Adirondack Life magazine and has contributed to numerous books and anthologies on Adirondack history and life. In addition, she has curated an exhibit entitled Dreaming of Timbuctoo at the John Brown Farm State Historic Site in North Island, New York. She is the author most recently of The Black Woods, Pursuing Racial Justice on the Adirondack Frontier, which of course will be the subject of her talk tonight. So please join me in welcoming Amy Godine.
Well, thanks everybody for coming out on such a dark night. At least it's not a dark and stormy night. I'm glad you're all here. I'm going to try and speak loudly, but when I flag, raise your hand so I know to lift my voice up a little more. I think I'll start this talk with a brief reading from the book that sort of fixes my hopes for it as much as anything else. This is the preface. And has anybody dipped into this book yet? Oh, yeah, but you don't count. You got it in. For 15 years before his death at 68 in 2013, the youth worker and environmentalist Brother Yusuf Abdul Wasi Burgess took teenagers from Albany camping in the Adirondack Mountains. Brother Yusuf supplied paddles, life jackets, and canoes. His first-time campers brought their wariness and disbelief. City kids from hard-used neighborhoods, they took a cool view of the 6 million acre Adirondack Park. Not only was it famously, unwaveringly white, but it seemed a land of grim dysfunctionality where nothing you relied on worked. You could not text a friend or parent. Nobody moved, dressed, or laughed in any way that made you feel at home. How this big green playpen, this so-called getaway, was anybody's notion of a good time was a mystery you did not care to solve. But Brother Yusuf, Brooklyn raised, never aimed to make his campers nature lovers. Learning bird calls, naming constellations, this was never the idea. The mission always was to challenge and relax his teenagers' idea of their turf. With a wider sense of place comes the glint of interest in a world beyond the close at hand with its hard defended codes. Some distant college or line of work may look more thinkable after overnighting in a tent by an icy stream. Test the comfort zone this once, and next time the kids would push it harder. A stretched out sense of where they fit here may lead to a respect for their historical connection to it, their right to call it theirs. For this reason, Brother Yusuf always took his campers to John Brown's Adirondack home. He told them about the radical abolitionists' assault on a federal armory in Harpers Ferry, Virginia, West Virginia today, from October 16 to 1859. With a hand-picked band of guerrilla fighters, Brown occupied the armory, aiming to deliver 100,000 muskets and rifles to nearby slaves who he hoped would join his effort to secure the territory between the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers, then push south to free more slaves, plantation by plantation. But stuck in a small engine house, Brown's group was no match for militiamen and Marines. His holdout fell in minutes. 10 men were killed, 2 sons of his among them. A Virginia jury convicted him of treason. On December 2nd, 1859, Old Brown was hanged. The teenagers Brother Yusuf took to the park knew Brown's name, but the impact of his raid, how Harper's Ferry blazed the road to the Civil War and the war to the legal freedom for 4 million Black Americans, how Brown's trial, the first to be reported nationally, has been judged the most important criminal trial in the history of the Republic. This was news for Yusuf's charges. Also revelatory, learning that John Brown came to the Adirondacks to join a settlement of Black pioneers. Back in the day, said Brother Yusuf, a stretch of Adirondack wilderness 10 times bigger than the city of Albany belonged to thousands of Black New Yorkers. They got this land, and Brown got his, from a New York abolitionist named Gerrit Smith. From the tiny town of Peterborough in upstate Madison County, this land-rich white man hoped his 40-acre Adirondack gift lots would pull poor Black families out of cities and put them on new farms. Back then, Black New Yorkers had to prove they owned land if they ever hoped to vote. No property, no ballot, a special rule for colored men alone. That's why Gerrit Smith came up with this idea in 1846. With their new parcels, Black New Yorkers could get out of the city, start farming, and gain the franchise. They could vote for candidates who hated slavery, vote for equal rights for all. They would be empowered, working citizens. That's what land could do. So you think twice before you tell me this place is for white folks, Brother Yusuf urged his campers out of Albany. You think hard before you say this place has nothing to do with you. This is your patrimony, your business. You don't have to buy this story, you own it. You're stakeholders. This land is my land. This land is yours. So I open with that. Well, that's a good start. Thank you. I open with that because it flags right away my hope that this book will help nudge a reconsideration of how people think about Adirondack history and about the Adirondack landscape in particular. It's been understood for a decade and a half at least as an overwhelmingly white, unwelcoming landscape. And there's been no sense in any written history of the importance of a Black community in Essex and Franklin counties and what it did to integrate and modify and, in a sense, in some cases, abolitionize the frontier. And with this book, I'm hoping there'll be a greater, wider excitement and consciousness of this heritage, this legacy that will change not just how people feel about the region, but who feels they belong to it, who feels they have a stake in it, not just as a visitor, a tourist, but as an owner of it, someone who is entitled to it. And I'm looking forward to that impact, which I think has already started. I think it's already going on right now. In the past several years, I've seen some documentaries on the little community called Timbuctoo. I've heard an oratorio. There's been an archaeological dig on the property of one of the Black settlers, a slew of podcasts, education projects, new choreography, 2 art installations at the John Brown Farm, a reunion of descendants of Smith grantees, numberless lectures, a children's play, 3 new historical markers in the last few years for vanished Black settlements or pioneers, and a massive state-funded grant for a project called the Timbuctoo Pipeline to get Black high school students from Brooklyn into the Adirondacks to learn about this history and its roots in racial justice and about environmental careers as well. In a few days, I'm going to be speaking at the Adirondack Park Agency, where the traveling exhibit I curated called Dreaming of Timbuctoo, which gave rise to this book, will be on display, to my amazement. And after that, it goes to an Adirondack correctional facility. These were not venues or organizations that recognized any ties between their missions and the racial justice story when I started researching it 20 years ago. Whoops, there you know, it just slipped out. Okay, things have changed. But you're here to find out why and how Gerrit Smith gave up this land and what actually happened. So I'm going to start not when he gave the land away in 1846, but when I think the story really launches, and that is at the Constitutional Convention of New York State in 1821, when the white delegates, men all, voted conclusively to change the suffrage regulations in New York so that all white men, the poorest of whom had to pay $100 in order to vote, no longer had to pay anything. Black men too had to pay $100 in order to gain the right to vote. As of 1821 and until 1870, 50 years in New York, they now had to pay or show evidence that they owned, not to pay, that they owned $250 in real estate, a sum that effectively disenfranchised the entire potential Black electorate in New York, which was the point, of course, because in a few years, all Black people would be, well, how to put it simply, abolition would be enforced in New York conclusively a few years hence, and the pro-slavery lobby, especially downstate where it was so strong, where business interests were so robust in dealings with the South, did not want to see anything that would facilitate the emergence of a new Black voting bloc. So ahead of the curve, they preemptively took a move that struck out any possibility of that happening, and that would stay the law in New York until 1870, and only federal law under the Constitution would revoke that. And New York protested that right to the end. Even after the feds passed it, they still griped about this law. So anyway, that law provokes a flurry of activist activity among Black reformers in the next 25 years, because the next constitutional convention that would revisit this voter restriction would not be until 1846. And so between 1821 and 1846, there's just a flurry of pro-suffrage activity between gathering signatures for petitions and gaining allies among the state assembly and lobbying for pro-suffrage feeling among their friends in politics and Black newspaper editorials and at the pulpit. And time comes for the assembly to vote, and once again, they can't get behind it. It reinforce the old racialized voter restriction. And of course, it's going to go to a plebiscite, and the plebiscite is even harder on Black voting rights in the fall. So it's a very dark time for Black reform, for all civil rights reform in New York. And in that context, civil rights, not civil rights, Gerrit Smith, who probably has more friends, I think, in the Black radical reform community than any other abolitionist, maybe in the Northeast, but certainly in New York State. He comes up with a plan. He comes up with a plan that's kind of an end run around the law. He says, do I have it written down? It's a wonderful quote. Smith tells his Black friends, since the state has determined that Black men must become landholders that they may be entitled to vote, they will become landholders. Vote they will, cost what it will. He has an enormous amount of land he inherited from his father, close to 1 million acres. He's added to that a whole lot more. He's tried to get rid of it. He's having a lot of trouble with that. People don't want his land. He's paying taxes on it he doesn't want to pay. He has land that impoverished people need and he doesn't need. His fortune is made and he thinks, I can help them do this if I give away 3,000 gift lots to 3,000 men to the tune of 120,000 acres. And I do it at warp speed. It won't work for this election, but it might work for another one. Are these lots worth $250? No, they might be worth at best 50, but if they are worked and improved, they'll gain that value in just a few years' time. And that's part of his that's part of his mission too. He sees, he's a Calvinist and he thinks you better work for this a little bit. I'm not going to give it to you wholesale. Things would have been a lot simpler if he'd just given away lots that were worth that amount outright, but that wasn't Gerrit Smith's style. And he also had a kind of romantic faith in the virtues of hard labor and how that would be a transformative force for Black city people turned farmers on their new land and forge new character and bring them up to speed and make them worthy of the role of as citizens of the Republic. So that's where we are when he announces this to the 13 reformers he picks to proselytize for this project and go out into the Black communities all over New York, but principally in the cities, and line up his 3,000 grantees. He divides his 13 agents into 4 committees. Each committee is assigned to another part of New York. There's one for metropolitan New York, one that goes from the Hudson Valley north to Canada, another one in central New York, and then for the far west. And of course, the hardest job falls to the New York City committee because that's where the preponderance of the Black population is. And he tells them, these are people who've agreed to do it for no pay. This is volunteer work, and they're all very hardworking men with full bore volunteer careers as activists, but they do it for no money, though he does give everyone a gift lot, which is nice. And he says, I want this by Christmas, basically, and it takes 2 years. It doesn't take till Christmas. He makes the announcement to them in August. He sets them loose with this job, and they have a few months, and it takes them a little longer. The problem is he doesn't anticipate pushback from potential grantees who don't like being told about one of his terms of eligibility. All the eligible grantees have to be demonstrably poor. They have to be from New York. They have to be of a certain age. They have to be respectable, but they also can't drink. And a lot of the grantees, several, complain to the agents, don't tell me how to live. I don't want you to be telling me what my social habits should be. And so there's resistance there, and that slows down the process, which is an interesting signal early on that Gerrit Smith doesn't understand this community he's helping quite as much as he thinks he does. So how do they get the word out? This is a part of my book I really enjoyed researching. They canvass New York. They take his terms of eligibility very seriously. If they sign up someone and then they discover something unsavory or disagreeable about the person, they write him and say, take back his deed, he's a blockhead. Give it to this guy instead. And there's quite a lot of, and you didn't get this guy's name spelled right, do it again, or you gave him land that's actually under a river. Could you redo that, please? And some of them take the job a little more seriously than others. The white agents, because this is an integrated committee, seem to me to have done very little work. The Black agents, who know many more of the people who need to be solicited, get much more of the job done of actually recruiting. And now we have to talk about what happened when the land, I always sort of drag my feet before we get to this spellbinding moment. There's several ways to read what happened, and I'm going to talk to you, I'm going to present 3 to you tonight, and I represent the 3 of them in my book. One is to see it, this is the most commonly known popular view, through the lens of Gerrit Smith's own expectations. In terms of what he hoped for, it was an absolutely epic bust. It was a disaster. He gave away a huge amount of land, maybe 200 people turned up, 50 grantees, 200 includes wives and children and other, I know, terrible, right? And I pump it up a little because I include fellow travelers who come up and join the grantees, not because they have grants, but because they're sympathetic to the effort. And also grantees who don't move into the sort of inner core region where most of them settle, but scatter more along Lake Champlain. And also because I include Black freed people who come up after the Civil War to join the settlements that are already in place or the households up there and make a life there. But even then, I can't pump up the number more than 250. We're still pretty low. That's as good as it gets. So we're at this low, disappointing number. And then we have the question of why. Why didn't they turn out? And I think this is a really interesting question, because this is when the process of racializing the story creeps into it early on. The first historians who tackle this assume, because Gerrit Smith is so active in the anti-slavery community and in getting fugitives freed and in helping people self-emancipate, that historians assumed he was designing this for fugitives. This was a place he meant to settle fugitives. There's no evidence for that, but that's the prevailing word in history books for a while. And the read on that is they could never hack it up here. They're from the sunny South. They've never had to boss themselves. They have no work skills. They've never been incentivized to develop initiative and planfulness and resourcefulness. And so they don't have it in them. And they're the children of Africa, and they're not used to this rotten weather, and they fall apart up here. And from soup to nuts, this story is thoroughly racialized in terms of Black incapacity and helplessness. The other take, which crops up a little later, is a little more forgiving. And that is that they were from New York. They weren't from the South, but they came from the cities. And as city people, they were accustomed to soft city jobs as barbers and waiters and tailors and laborers, and nothing on the order of hardcore farming. And they simply couldn't measure up to that. Same thing, they didn't have the inner stuff. They lacked the grit and the tenacity and the habits to make it in the country on a serious frontier farm. My reading is very different. Everything I learned about the world of the grantees at mid-century tells me that Gerrit Smith didn't do his homework. He thoroughly underestimated the expense of moving to the frontier. Agricultural historians have explained that it took at least $1,500 at the outset to get a farm up and running, to make the move, get your stuff going, get your farm cleared, get it settled, wait out the first year when crops aren't even up, and last through that second year. And without that, from the Midwest to the far West, and surely the Adirondacks too, farmers came home. They couldn't help it. If they didn't have that initial seedbed, they couldn't launch. And Gerrit Smith completely misunderstood this. He assumed that giving them the paper alone would guarantee their success, and that wasn't the case. And that's a lesson I don't think he ever wanted to hear. Frederick Douglass warns him about this early on. He says they need money. If they don't have money, this thing is going to fail. But he doesn't say it directly to Smith. He puts it in his newspaper. That's a little different. One of Smith's agents says the same thing to him in a letter. He says they don't have a team of horses. They don't have enough money to pull their stumps. How are they going to make it without this? But he doesn't take the next step and say, will you help them out? Will you send the money, at least the ones on the frontier already? I think there's a diffidence among the Black reformers who don't want to cross this great benefactor who is bankrolling their newspapers, their anti-slavery societies, their work with fugitives, their churches, and their conventions to such a huge extent. So that's an interesting problem that underlies this story too. White philanthropy, and when it's very problematic. But then I nudge Smith out of the way, and that's when I come to my second understanding of this story. And then my reading of it is much more charitable. I pay more attention in the second part of my book, once I've got everybody on the ground and in place, to how things went for them when they were there. And I get that Gerrit Smith isn't in the picture at this point. We're looking at the people on the land and how they fared. And what I find is that household to household on this underpopulated, now integrated frontier, the grantees challenged white assumptions about Black incompetence and unfitness for this life, and they claimed a civic role in a civic society that had long been denied them. Their kids, for the first time, are going to integrated schools, not possible in the city. They're going to integrated churches. They're starting integrated singing groups and Sunday school classes. They are on integrated work crews. They are signing up for town posts that are now integrated for tax collector, road inspector, constable, inspector of elections, and the fire crew. The grantee's son, Alex Hazard, from this neighborhood, from Jackson, his family is from Washington County. He got good enough at tracking game to work as an Adirondack guide. In fact, there are several Black Adirondack guides. Lyman F's the most famous of the grantees for his close friendship with John Brown. I write quite a lot about him and his son in my book. He hacked a trail through Indian Pass, the first one. There's socializing with white neighbors, interracial Christmas dinners, climbing parties at Mount Whiteface. Election day was integrated. They did vote, and this happened pretty early on, and that's reflected in town voting lists in town records, the ones that still save them in the Adirondacks. The library committee that founded Lake Placid's library was integrated. There was mutual testifying among Black and white poor farmers for the redemption of your farm when it was seized by the state or the county for overdue back taxes. And this is a place where I found considerable support that one Black farmer gave to his white neighbors, and they to him in turn, buried in the tax archives in Albany in the state archives. And that was a thrilling find. And they witnessed each other's weddings and births as well. Much of this information about the granularity of this community only surfaced in records that have not been digitized at all. And I'm going to read a paragraph from my book that drew on some military pension claims from Black veterans or their widows. I turned up in the National Archive in DC, which was a phenomenal resource for information about how these people live their daily lives. We are farmers. So is Charles H. Hazard, one of your Washington County people. He has employed us, so have we him on our farms, said the St. Armand farmer Sylvester Reed in 1891. And Reed, not the military pension bureau, knew for a fact that when Hazard was on the farm, he could be so convulsed with pain, he had to be carried from the field. This is concerning the appeal for military medical pension upgrades. I knew her when she was a small girl, said Eunice Swinier of the grantee's daughter, Charlotte Morehouse. I knew her at the time of her marriage to Stephen W. Morehouse, and know that she was never married before and has not been married since he died. She has always lived within a few rods of me, and if she married, I should have known it. Eunice also knew of all of Charlotte's children's birthdays, their middle names, and when Henry first had fits and was seized by paralysis. Who told her this? She was in the room. What greater authority was there than what she knew, quote, by personal knowledge? It was the sense of a fellow you got from growing up with him, watching him gut a fish, prune an apple tree, soothe a fretful child. Not just anybody could claim the patrimony of community. New people with big estates and clubs and second homes and camps were cutting up the country like a currant cake, but they couldn't touch the birthright of lived experience. Not everything was up for grabs. Other evidence of this deeply intersectional life on the frontier, school records, town meeting minutes, voting records, and tax records I spoke about. In a county history, there's an offhand story, but a memorable one now especially, of a self-freed slave who became a Gerrit Smith grantee when he was living in Troy and moves to the Adirondacks, finds his land unsatisfactory, which almost every grantee did. Almost all of them moved to better land. They squat on it, and then they buy that or they get that from Gerrit Smith. And that goes for white settlers too. Squatting was just the regional tradition, and you went to the land you might have bought, but you settled for land you liked much more. This guy starts quite an impressive farm and writes about it later in a letter to Gerrit Smith, but he doesn't write about the time that a slave hunter followed him, probably in the 50s, to Franklin County to seize him and take him back, and is intercepted before he meets John Thomas by Thomas's white neighbors, who tell this man, he knows you're coming, he's armed, we know he's armed, and if you go after him, you'll be dealing with us too. And the slave hunter goes away. I assumed this was a fanciful white heroism Underground Railroad story when I first read it, until I read about the high esteem his neighbors held him in the tax records and other archival sources. And that to me underscored the likely truth of this story. And as of a month ago, I think, a brook that for 100 years in the Adirondacks, a long brook that had borne a racist name for a century, was renamed for this grantee, and the crowd that came to that, another proof of hopefulness of how the Adirondack cultural landscape is changing, exceeded 100 people, which is really something. Let's see what else. County. Okay, we're going to another point here. We're going past. I think I skipped an important point, but I think I can just tell you what it is. For all I'm telling you about that down. For all I'm telling you about how much the grantees achieved in their integrated efforts on the frontier, I'm not really, I don't mean to suggest that this was a post-racial utopia in any way. Jim Crow still prevailed. And when I look at subsequent generations after the first generation and their children on the frontier, the progress does not show up. That becomes that their white neighbors experience. There isn't the advancement. Their jobs stay, they hit a ceiling. And Black grandchildren of the grantee farmers and their descendants never are able to get past that ceiling in the Adirondacks. It seems that the necessity of frontier life, when it was underpopulated and required people to work as partners and collaborate and help each other, is not sustainable, or was not sustainable in the Adirondacks. Once the population came in, which meant you didn't have to look to your fellow farmer who happened to be Black to help you with this, and he couldn't look to you in turn. That's a sweeping generalization, but that is what the data suggests, that this wasn't sustained the way it might have been if there had been more top-down support for this effort, not ground level support. And I can talk more about that at the end, how I think you really need both. And it didn't happen in the Black Woods. But that said, it's still way ahead of the curve. I have to look at it not just in terms of how the fates of Black farmers and their descendants compare with their white neighbors, but also in terms of their trajectory and where they came from in the first place. And to compare the lives of the Black pioneers in the Adirondacks with what they left behind in New York City and what they left behind in Maryland and Louisiana, because many of them did come from slave states, though this wasn't Gerrit Smith's plan. That's how it worked out. And always the arithmetic favors the Adirondack experience over what was left behind, what was put behind them. Always, when I compare the fate of Black Marylanders after the Civil War with what was happening on John Thomas's farm, when he is thoroughly independent, he's got hundreds of dollars in savings, he begins to be regarded as an American citizen, he writes, in 1872. That's 30 years after he gets to his land. He's just beginning, but he says this to Gerrit Smith with delight and pride, even though American citizen is in quotes, which I think is telling. So it's a very nuanced story. There's gains, but there's also a lack of progress, and both bespeak a very prickly, complicated social and political landscape. And I think recognizing that complexity is a big part of the challenge of getting this story. I think we want things a lot simpler now and a little more decisively awful, decisively thrilling, and it's neither. It's really a blend, and it's a mess. It's a big American mess, as I call it, and I think that's fair. Another thing that happens, and this is the third part of my book, and this is the part for me that was almost the most exciting to work on, had to do with how this story was told, how it gets reported over the ages. You know, the history of the Adirondacks and county histories come of age in the late 19th century, and this is the progressive era, the Gilded Age, and this is when white Americans of Anglo descent are getting very anxious about race pollution, about immigration, about miscegenation, about the influx of dark and strange people from the South and from Europe. And when this will all come to a climax in the 20s, when the laws change and are so emphatically racist in this country. But it's all boiling up in the era of eugenics and concern about social purity, which anneals to the conservation discourse, which is about environmental purity. And that is obviously the great movement that gives us the Adirondack Park and has saved 6 million acres up there that we can all enjoy. It also gives us a legacy of social exclusivity, of parks that were violently exclusionary, anti-Semitic, never mind Black, that wasn't even in the picture, but anti-Hispanic, anti-Semitic, anti-poor, anti-radical, and so forth. And this is an Adirondack legacy too. And this is what's calling the shots in how history gets framed and how history gets written. And what I see in one prominent and popular history after another, most famously Alfred Donaldson's 2-volume History of the Adirondacks, are takes on the Black experience that picture the Black settlers as incapable and unworthy of this bounty, not as non-belongers, as emblematic of people who don't fit, who haven't earned the right to be here. God bless them, they can't help it. It's not their fault. This is never mean or malicious in any obvious way. It's very mournful or forgiving or comic, but it's always about incapacity. And that slant, I think, lasts until the 1970s or so, and really has taken forever to be challenged. But that is the way the history's come down. So to grapple with that and understand how this community was pictured has everything to do with the identity of the Adirondacks itself and how it sees itself as this pure landscape, this inviolable, exceptionalist landscape, was very helpful to me, very interesting. And then I wind up the book with where I kind of started, which are all the sort of more heartening, hopeful stories about where Adirondack culture, history, and self-consciousness is heading. And all the wonderful new developments that signal a new attitude toward what the Adirondack Park means today. But I think I'm hoarse, and I want to stop talking and ask for some water and ask for some questions. Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
In the first part of the book, the Black Woods area, is that just around North Elba?
No.
What kind of a geography?
That was thank you for asking that. I forgot to make the point. Another way that histories racialized the story, it was to center it around John Brown's presence. He is the epic central character, and the only reason we know anything about the settlement he lived near which was called Timbuctoo, and was very fleetingly on the ground. And if it weren't for him, we might know even less than we do. But because of historians and biographers' rapt interest in his fascinating career, nobody ventured north to explore the presence of grantees in nearby towns. And it turns out there was a Blacksville, there was a Freeman's Home, there was a Negro Brook and a Negro Hill. There was I'm forgetting which one? Well, Vermontville had many Black people in it, and so did St. Armand. Averyville's another one. There were all these enclaves all over that reach into Franklin County, north into Duane, closer to Malone. And the wider geography of the landscape is really missing, but that's something that I and several other researchers have been recovering in the last 10 years, and that's really gratifying to rewrite the map of this integrated world. Yes, sir.
Do you have the name of Newcomb anywhere in your mind?
Well, Newcomb does figure in my story. First, I just spoke there 2 days ago. It's really beautiful. Are you from there, or?
No, but the folks that lived across from where we lived
Yeah,
were Newcombs.
Yeah.
And they had slaves,
really?
and the area where they kept the slaves is still pretty much there. There are slaves buried on the farm.
But that's not in Newcomb, New York.
No, that's in Johnsonville, New York.
Okay.
And-
Right, yeah.
But the Newcomb name came from that Newcomb.
Oh, how
family.
interesting. I'm glad to know that.
And they had quite a little land. They had this big farm, they had another area, had a big pond.
Yeah,
They were and they had quite a lot of money. They came up, I understand, from Dutchess County.
uh-huh,
And they had a.
that
big
makes
home
sense,
there,
yeah.
And they built this home similar to.
yeah. Well, Newcomb, New York, which was named for this family, figures in my book once. There's a trail that goes from North Elba to Newcomb, where, according to oral legend, Black farmers from North Elba would have walked to go for work for hire in the spring and work in various farmers' fields in Newcomb. So there's some intercourse there.
In 1909, my grandfather, a couple came from Virginia. And they were looking for a place to live and where he could work. And my grandfather hired him. And he worked for 2 different families. And he usually walked the distance when he was going to be. And in the house, where my grandfather's house, there is still a room that is William's room. That was his name. William. And that everybody said, how did they get that name? That, it's William's room. It's always been that way. And he would never sit at the table with the white folks.
Okay.
He just never did.
Well, I'm glad to know about the origin of Newcomb. I had no idea that it came from down there. I'm going to take this fellow's arm because it's been up for a while.
I wait to learn more from your book, but did it occur to you as you did research on this that Smith represents, like so many white reformers before him, that we're going to create this largesse for Blacks? And he's surprised at the lack of enthusiasm. Then look what I'm going to give you, this life, that you'll create this wonderful, joyful life of freedom from the land.
Yeah.
We're talking in the case of freed slaves from the South, people probably had a belly full of living off the land.
Yeah.
And chasing a mule around
Well,
and chopping cotton.
That's
They didn't rush up there
yes.
hundreds of miles away to do the same thing. Or as you pointed out, city people had no concept of what they were getting into. Also, this wasn't Iowa cornland, it's a pretty rough area.
Well, stop, because you're giving me 4 ideas at once. So I want to run with it
I missed
before I
it,
forget
stop
too. I have so much to say about what you just said. First of all, in 1857, Smith is asked by Horace Greeley, okay, it didn't work out. What really happened? Will you tell our readers what went wrong? And Smith comes clean and he says, okay, maybe the land was not so hot. But then he peddles it. And then he says, but white farmers who are thrifty and hardworking seem to do okay on it. So what, considering the character of our colored friends, could we expect? And that is a sea change for him, to racialize the experience of his own beneficiaries and blame it all on them. And I think that is the green light for historians from that point on to say, look, if Smith says they didn't have the right stuff, we're gonna take that ball and go with that. Because if he's on board with that, yeah.
Can you talk about Gerrit Smith a little bit though? Because I mean, he was a very complicated figure.
I think
and
so.
his relationship with John Brown, which I don't fully understand, except, and didn't he end up in a mental hospital around that time?
Yeah, when John Brown is apprehended at Harper's Ferry, and it becomes clear that his backers, I didn't read the article you did, so you're ahead of me in what you're remembering about it. But the Secret Six, as they would come to be known, Brown's financial backers, and Smith is one of the most generous of them all respond very differently to the threat of arrest and possible execution. A couple go to Canada. A couple say, come and get me. I'm not scared. Thomas Higginson, I think, responded
Yes,
that way, the great newspaper publisher and activist. Gerrit Smith, who has in his defense, and I don't know if the article acknowledges this, a history of bipolarity. What would have been called manic depression, but he would go into deep funks and then he would have accelerated manic episodes. And I think this propelled him into a mega funk. And his family or his doctor have him committed to the Utica Asylum for treatment for depression. And he's out of there in a few months' time. He's not allowed to read while he's in getting treated, and he gets a lot of marijuana. That's another feature of his treatment. But and many historians who are skeptical about him felt this was a craven way to escape persecution. But I give him the benefit of the doubt on this one, because his funks are so famously charted in his biographies. But does that answer your question? I don't think so. I think I got off
So
track.
he basically was a financial backer of John Brown, but clearly supported his cause. And
Yes, but claims
then-
not to have known about what he was planning to do at Harper's
Right,
Ferry.
right, but then in 1857, he's coming out with these statements, these condescending statements towards the people who he had also funded.
Yes, he's
Very
not
contradictory.
always consistent in
Yeah.
his, but he was embarrassed by this. He felt he looked foolish. He felt he never wanted to talk about this. In his own autobiography, which he writes in the third person, he doesn't mention this. He bundles this in with other philanthropic schemes. I mean, among other things, I make the point in my book that his initiative anticipates affirmative action. It's an affirmative action campaign. He's saying, I realize white men are as poor as black men, but there's a difference here. Black men can't vote. So I'm going to make up the difference and I'm going to even out the playing field for black men. That's affirmative action early on before it has its name. In giving land away, he doesn't need to people who need it. He's enacting environmental distributive justice. In its time, he's also anticipating providing his pioneer grantees with housing sources in a time of a housing scarcity and wretched housing in New York City. He's looking toward suffrage reform and fighting suffrage repression. Well, what could be more current than that? So in so many respects, and also the interracial nature of his recruitment committee, he anticipates so many games and strategies and trends of our own time. But it didn't work in his time. But it was rather visionary all the same, I
It's
think.
kind of tragic that then he doesn't claim for himself that.
It is
anything
kind of
has
tragic.
Visionary status.
Yeah, and he does something else that gets him in trouble with his supporters, and this is something that's really interesting. After the Civil War, he and Horace Greeley, great Unionists, and Gerrit Smith, the great abolitionist and another tycoon, maybe Vanderbilt. They paid Jefferson Davis's bail to get him out of jail where he's been held without a trial for a couple of years. And this outrages the Union flanks who've survived the war. They cannot afford why he's springing for this man who brought such devastation on the nation, on their view. And he says, his idea is he's a true Christian, and he really feels if he sets the example for charity and forgiveness, his example will be catching, and the former slave owners in the South will look with more charity on the freed people. I think he really believes this, and proof of this is his true outrage and sense of betrayal a few years later when it becomes really clear that's not going to happen. Yeah. There was something else you said, I can't remember.
Earlier,
Which one? Yeah, but we'll get to it. Yeah, someone else.
Well, I'll just finish up on my story. This family was in the area when my mother came to teach. So she had these children in school, 6 of them. And those children were exceptional in school, in their music. And one of the oldest boy became an aeronautical engineer and worked in Chicago until his death.
Huh.
So these children came, but I can remember, there were no black people, but those folks.
Where was the school?
Pardon?
Where was the school?
The school was about
half a mile from us.
or a little more.
Oh, pretty close then.
Yeah,
Huh.
the school.
What was their name?
Conway,
Conway, okay.
and there's still Conway folks. The only girl married here in Hoosick Falls,
Yeah,
and some of her generation.
well, I recommend a
history.
book for you, but I'll tell you later, but it charts Black families in this region very assiduously through generations, and it's really good.
you mentioned success stories, ancestors of these people who are still farming and making a living.
Nobody was still farming their land by the late night. There were 2 families still farming that I'm aware of, both of them hazards from Washington County originally, who were still, and their ancestors will continue to farm until they go into bankruptcy as poor. Huh?
Descendants will continue.
Descendants, yes.
Good ancestors.
I didn't mean that, thanks, yeah. They farm until their farm's taken away from them for bankruptcy, which is happening to poor farmers, white and black, all over the Northeast in the first quarter of this century. And as far as great success stories of descendants,
I don't know, success stories, but people who are still farming and living off.
I don't know of a single descendant of a Smith grantee who identifies with farming or sees that as in fact, it's Black farmers in the Adirondack region are very few. I've heard of one family. Do you know of any more, Benita?
There was another one, but they were around Westport.
Yeah. There is a rise now in Black self-sufficient, market-oriented small farms in the Adirondacks, especially in the Lake Champlain region. Not so much in the area I'm talking about, which is not unsuited to farming, but there are better ways to make money there. But the farmers market scene in the Adirondacks is absolutely booming. What you don't see are black farmers at those stands, or people of color at all. Yeah.
Question from Zoom. Sorry, more than one. There you go. Are you connecting this history to new Black farms such as Soulfire Farm in Troy, New York?
I mentioned Soulfire Farm in my epilogue, and describe it, not Soulfire in particular, but the whole new agrarian Black movement as an obvious takeoff point for more scholarship, and also expressing my hope that they know something of this story, because I think there's a big a big knowledge gap between people farming and knowing about this particular strain of social justice work in farming and its connection to voting equality and so forth. So, but that's as far as I go with it. But God bless her, she's doing great work there. She came to talk at the John Brown Farm, and the John Brown Farm folks and John Brown Lives are very aware of her work and have honored it. Yeah.
I was also struck by you started speaking about the lack of experience in civic organization. Did you not? About
Civic organization?
as they tried to set up these communities,
Yeah,
that the Black people coming in, of course, had no experience in all of that.
they had no experience, but the
And
communities were just starting, and so they needed their help.
There was a section of Iowa that
Yeah.
was far better land than the Adirondacks that were indeed set aside and given to homesteaders, Black homesteaders. There's still a trace of it there, but it too didn't succeed. And I remember an economist talking about the fact that no experience in civic organization and running that. It's not just enough to plant the soil, you have to be able to do other things to make.
Well, I think the real headache in the Adirondacks is nobody of any color has ever made a living by just farming. You have to diversify your income, and the ones who manage are the ones who are also road workers, or also Adirondack guides, or who are also harvesting their maple syrup and selling that on the market. But if you don't enter the market at a certain point in the Adirondacks, your farm fails. Subsistence farms just don't make it there after the market economy starts to swallow up these farms and create big farming conglomerates that are furnishing the new service economy and the new hotels. And if you aren't part of that, you're not going to last. And so they don't. Yeah,
So,
yeah.
wasn't it, a lot of those farms that Gerrit Smith gave, the Black farms, they were scattered, and so to think that they were churches with white people because
Yeah.
it was hard for them to pull everybody together and start to, they were miles apart from each other.
Yeah.
weren't they, at the time?
Which is what they wanted. He wanted that too.
They wanted to be separated, or he wanted them to be that far
He wanted them to not cluster. He had a horror of clustered Black enclaves or towns. He wanted them to integrate with their white neighbors. So did the Black agents, who absolutely did not want to see this experience become ghettoized before it was out of the gate. Actually, what the Black settlers do is settle near, not necessarily on top of, neighbors from the sections of New York they came from. So Troy grantees are close. New York City grantees are close. Ones who come from the Hudson River Valley are close. But are they cheek by jowl? No, there are always white neighbors to integrate that neighborhood. So it's not as tight as it might sound. It's not like the community in Iowa or the ones in Ohio or Indiana that are set up that are explicitly Black farm communities.
But it makes it harder for them to do cultural things together.
Yes, and that might have been church, but there are churches everywhere, so everybody's going to their hometown church, not to.
What about the integrated schools you mentioned?
What about them?
I mean, so within this disparate area where people are quite far away, their kids were still being able to get to an integrated school.
Yeah, these schools might be a farmhouse that's furnishing 6th grades or something, and maybe 20 kids, so nobody's crossing. No, there's no discussion I encountered of an all-Black school or anything like that. I think the schools serve the Black and white communities quite well in the Adirondacks. But do Black students go on to law school? Is there ever a Black teacher in an integrated school? Will there ever be a Black superintendent? No, that level of profound structural integration doesn't occur. Yeah, it's compromised.
Similarly with the Quakers.
Yeah.
When they were having integrated schools, there was always a white teacher.
That's right. That's right. Reading that. One more question?
Just a quick one. Someone's asking, what's the name of the book that you mentioned that assiduously describes Black families in the area?
that you referenced a couple moments ago.
Oh, this is not an Adirondack book, it's a Washington County book. By a friend of mine named Ken Perry, and it's called People of Lowly Life. And if you want to know about Washington County, this is your book. It's really good. If you want to know about the Adirondacks and general Black history in that region, I'd recommend Sally Svensson's book, Blacks in the Adirondacks, which is quite a lively book. And there are others. But first get mine. Thanks so much.
Great sign off.
And is there somewhere I can sign books and,
Yes, absolutely. We
Great.
will, we'll bring a table up for you,
Cool.
Amy.
that'd be great.
You promised with a flourish.